Hey, this is John, and welcome to Olive Grove Woodshop. On today's episode, I'm going to do my best to remember sophomore geometry, tackle some compound angles, and show you what really goes into making some custom veneering. So let's get into it. What I'm actually building is a pulpit for a local church, and to be honest, when I was initially asked about building one, I wasn't that interested, because when I think of pulpits, I picture those big boxy ones with a ton of fine trim carpentry, which really isn't what I enjoy doing. Mainly because of the linear and fixed look that goes along with that style. That's not a knock against that type of woodworking. I actually spent a few years learning trim carpentry before I settled into the electrical trade. So I know from experience that it takes some serious skill and craftsmanship to create those types of pieces. Plus, I'm pretty sure I've seen every episode of the new Yankee Workshop at least a few times. Hell, I remember as a kid hanging around to watch an episode with my dad when it would come on after the Saturday morning cartoons on PBS. And I'll still sneak an episode here and there when my wife and girls and I are enjoying the rare lazy weekend morning. It's just for me, I've always been drawn to the more free-flowing designs that accentuate the natural qualities of the wood I'm working with. I guess you could say my woodworking style is a little less Norm Abrams and a little more George Nakashima. But here's something really cool about woodworking. You never really stop growing and learning. There's always something new to try, so your style will always be evolving. And I'm willing to bet that no matter where you started from, you'll end up somewhere totally different. I'm extremely fortunate that I was introduced to woodworking at a young age by my dad, who is an excellent woodworker in his own right. He had my siblings and I in his old basement shop when we were little kids, making things like birdhouses and rubber band guns. Now, my dad is the type of woodworker that you give him a set of plans and he can build it to a T. And over the years, as grandkids have come along, he's built some really awesome things for them. Everything from mini functional construction equipment made out of hardwoods that weighed like 20 pounds apiece for my nephews, or scaled down nursery doll furniture for my girls, and even strollers that were big enough for my girls to fit in, so naturally they became rally push carts that scuffed the hell out of the walls and corners of our old house, because after all, rubbing is racing. But if you asked him to make something without a set of measured drawings, well then you might as well have asked him to solve the riddle of the Sphinx. Now the reason I'm mentioning all of this is because even though that's how I first learned woodworking, as time went by, I developed a completely different way of doing things because it just felt more natural to me, which meant I was more comfortable branching out and trying new techniques. Now aside from a rough sketch here and there with some basic dimensions, I never work from plans. I'm one of those psychopaths who can just visualize something and start building it, which I fully admit sounds like a load of bull, but I promise you, we exist. So back to the pulpit. Luckily for me, the pastor wasn't interested in a big gaudy pulpit and wanted a more simple style, which is what I'm building here. And as with all my projects, it starts with rough sawn lumber, and because it's such a simple design, I wanted there to be some contrast between the top and sides. So we settled on Ambrosia maple for the sides and rustic black walnut for the top and small shelf that will be tucked underneath. Now I talk a lot about wood character and how important it is for what I consider my style of woodworking. But I just don't understand the obsession in the furniture world with having a perfectly uniform look to the wood. I get that the more ornate the furniture design is, the less character you want in the wood because the two can definitely clash. But let's be honest. There's not a lot of new Victorian furniture being designed and built these days. And I fully acknowledge that me going on and on about how much better wood with character is will only hurt me in the long run because at the moment, the wood I prefer to use is typically a little cheaper because of the so-called defects that I would argue give it its character, thus making it the more desirable option. But I still stand by what I said. Plain wood sucks and knotty wood kicks ass. So here's another kernel of wisdom I'd like to offer up. Always make sure the materials you suggest to a client are available before you go suggesting them and then basing an entire design around them. And I guess because it's sometimes better to be stupid than lucky, or in my case, maybe a bit of both. Because when I talked up how good Ambrosia maple would look next to the black walnut, I had no idea that when I made the drive down to my lumber supplier that I'd have to scrounge around for basically the last piece they had that was big enough to work for this project. So take it from me, always double check first so you don't go putting your big old foot in your mouth. As this thing was beginning to come together, I started to realize there were some little tidbits, or life lessons if you will, swirling around this whole project. The first one that hit me was because, as usual, I was using what most people would consider low-quality wood to build this pulpit. After all, the holes and staining from the beetle larval damage to what would otherwise have been even-grained maple is the reason you don't see much furniture being made from Ambrosia maple. And all the knots, limb inclusions, and crisscross graining of the rustic walnut are the reasons why it's consistently passed over for so-called high-end furniture. But here I was taking all this less than desirable material and turning it into something beautiful, and that just seemed like a perfect metaphor for how we sometimes see things. And maybe there's more to something than how it appears. Then there was the fact that most of the pulpits I found when looking for examples and inspiration were these big, over-the-top monstrosities that held the speaker high above the crowd as if they were somehow better than those they were speaking to. But a simple stand to balance yourself against could help deliver just as powerful of a message as some towering mass. And the perceived position of the person delivering it did nothing to the strength of the message being delivered, because someone on an old soda crate could move you just as much as a person on a gilded pedestal. So I guess what I'm saying is, it's not how the message gets to you that's important. It's how the message makes you feel, and what you do with it that matters most in life. So once I got all the rough lumber back to my shop and began working out the dimensions and angles, I realized that making solid panels could end up being a disaster because of wood movement. There's a reason why most furniture in commercial buildings is made from laminate and veneer. The temperature and humidity in buildings, especially older buildings like the church this is for, can fluctuate wildly through the seasons, and in some cases even throughout the day. And there was only one way I'd be confident in the long-term stability of this thing, and that was with veneered panels. And if you've seen any of my other work, you'd know that store-bought veneered plywood ain't gonna cut it, so making veneers was my only option. So I feel like veneered furniture gets a bad rap. First off, when you say veneer, most people think a cheap particle board furniture with a paper-thin layer that may or may not even be wood. Or they think of the old furniture they grew up with that's since been painted half a dozen times to cover up the old lacquer mahogany. But the truth is, when done right, veneer can make some truly beautiful pieces, but it's going to take a good bit of work, and just how much depends on the options at your disposal. Now there's a few ways to go about it. One of the first choices is what to use for the core, and the two most commonly available options are MDF and plywood. MDF is great, especially if you want to add some weight to your panels. But because the humidity might be a factor, I chose to go with cabinet-grade plywood as an extra precaution. The next decision is how you're going to handle the edges. Basic veneer has edge banding, which you should always make your own to help make sure the edge color and grain match the panel faces. The other option is to add a rail all the way around your panel like I'm doing for these. Just remember, if you're using dominoes to attach the rails to the core, that you make sure they are wide enough to allow for final trimming, so you don't accidentally expose the dominoes when you make your final cut. And don't ask me how I know that, because I definitely didn't waste a whole weekend making panels, only to find out I had miscalculated their width when I was trimming them to their final size, and therefore exposing the dominoes. Which would have been a massive pain because I really only have weekends to work on my projects, so losing a whole weekend would have been a huge deal, not to mention wasting all the veneer pieces that took countless hours to resaw, sand, and prep. Now, if I was the kind of woodworker that makes that kind of mistake, that probably means I've made enough mistakes over the years to learn that you should always account for future problems whenever possible. And since you're going through the trouble of making all these very specific parts for a project, it might be a good idea to make a few spares. You know, just in case. Now, had I made that kind of boneheaded mistake, I totally would have also had the foresight to make some extra veneer so I could slap together some new panels that were the correct width and totally save the project. Alright, so where were we? The next thing to decide is how you're going to glue up the veneer to the panel cores. The easiest and least expensive way is to use contact cement and a heavy J-roller, but I've never been super confident with that method, and I was using thicker veneer that didn't have the woven or paper backing that most commercially available veneers has. So I settled on using vacuum pressure to adhere my panels. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the thickness of the veneer, because it's more important than most people realize. Obviously, the thickness matters visually, but if you're making your own veneer, you have more control over how the edge looks and its ability to blend in and look more natural. But a common mistake made by beginners is leaving the veneer layer too thick, which basically leaves too much of the original wood's bound up energy, which will allow it to move too much independently from the core, causing the whole thing to pull itself apart. The general rule of thumb is not to exceed an 1/8 inch thick for flat panels. And actually, if you've ever looked at or installed engineered wood flooring, the top layer is rarely thicker than 1/8 of an inch, and in most cases it's barely over a 1/16. Now, if you're doing curves or bends, you can go thicker because you're essentially forcing all that bound up energy to stretch out across the surface of the bend. And the only real limiting factor when it comes to thickness is the thicker it is, the harder it is to bend, and the higher likelihood of it splitting. If you want to bend thicker pieces of wood and less of them, your best bet is steam bending, which is a whole nother animal altogether. And then if you really want to get crazy with it, you can combine steam bending with vacuum pressing to avoid having to use a million clamps when it comes to longer pieces. But remember, and this is extremely important, if you're going to put a steamed piece of wood into a vacuum bag, you need to have a moisture separator between the bag and your pump, or you're going to destroy an expensive piece of equipment. And one of the last factors that plays a part in determining the final thickness for flat panels is the species of wood you're using. Generally speaking, the harder the wood, the less movement can be expected. So we're back to what I think is the best way to adhere this veneer, and that's through vacuum pressing. And there's a few ways to go about it. For a long time, there were no viable ready-made options for hobbyists and small outfits like us. So we were all left to our own devices to find our own way to fill that void. My first foray into vacuum pressing was some ways back, and it initially started with a shop vac, some 6mm visqueen, and an absurd amount of duct tape. Needless to say, it did not go very well, and I ended up using just as many conventional clamps as I would have without the vacuum. Next up was borrowing a vacuum pump from a buddy who was an HVAC tech, and after much trial and error and countless runs to the hardware store, I had all the parts and pieces to get an honest-to-goodness vacuum, and it actually worked. But there was one major drawback. I couldn't leave the vacuum pump running nonstop for risk of burning up an expensive piece of equipment that wasn't even mine. And no matter how much tape and sealant I used, I couldn't keep a continuous vacuum with the pump off. So I pretty much shelved trying to utilize vacuum pressing at that point, figuring I'd fool with it one day down the road. Since then, there have been a few functional designs that have made their way onto YouTube that involve either an air compressor or off-the-shelf vacuum pumps. But by the time you buy all the parts, you're out a few $100 for some bulky Frankenstein pump that is only as reliable as the random parts you've thrown together. Which brings us to today's sponsor, VACUPRESS. They offer a whole line of vacuum machines and accessories to get the job done, no matter the size and scale of your project, because they are specifically designed for woodworking. Plus their website is chock full of how-tos and other resources you'll need to get into vacuum pressing. I'm using their compact 150 with their 30mm vinyl bag that can hold up to a 4-foot by 4-foot piece. Now keep in mind I'm using it for its most basic purpose, because as I mentioned earlier, you can also use vacuum pressing for wood bending and curved forming. And now that I have one, I can't wait to push the limits of the type of furniture designs I can bring to life. And to quote the universe's most legendary outlaw, I'm gonna make some weird shit. Their pumps come ready to use right out of the box, but you'll still need to make a rigid base for the pieces to sit on that allows air to easily flow around everything so you can get even pressure in the proper vacuum. The nice thing is all you need is some scrap plywood with some 1/8 inch grooves cut in a grid and a small hole for the vacuum port. You can also add a layer of plastic mesh to help even out the airflow and pressure between the pieces. When it comes to gluing up the panels, I use classic hide glue because it has a long working time. And being that this was my first time using this system, I figured the more time I could give myself, the better. But keep in mind, it also has a significantly longer cure time and can take a few days to fully cure depending on the temp and humidity. And since I was in my still unconditioned shop in the Florida summertime, it took a while to cure. But this was one of the few times that not having much shop time during the week actually worked out, since I wouldn't touch them again for a few days. Now again, this was my first time using this pressing system, and after a few trial runs I was worried about sharp corners piercing the bag, so I thought it would be a good idea to dig out some scrap insulation pieces and put them over the corners to help protect the bag. But in reality, it was just overkill and wasn't necessary. These bags are plenty strong. What's really crazy about this project is that a solid 90% of the work was just making panels. Seriously, we're over halfway through this video and I'm still working on just the first 2 panels. And speaking of being halfway through, if you've made it this far, I'm going to assume you're enjoying at least some aspects of this, and I'd really appreciate it if you could hit like and subscribe. I'd really like to keep making more content like this, and support from folks like you really does help make that happen. So thanks again for the support. Once all the glue is finally cured, I can work towards finishing the panels. And that starts with addressing any voids, cracks, or small holes from the bugs. Luckily, because all the blemishes are relatively small, I can take care of them with CA glue instead of epoxy, which means I don't have to wait to run them through another round on the planer to clean them up and bring them to their final thickness. Just remember to avoid taking too much material off in one pass because it could cause tear out, and keep track of which side is which so you can give them each the same number of thin passes to keep everything uniform. Alright, so now I need to do everything I just did all over again except for in Walnut this time, and that perfectly sums up what most people don't realize about real veneer. It is enormously labor intensive and you need specific tools to do it. And even then, it can still generate a good bit of waste. And to anyone who's made their own in the past, you probably cringed earlier when you saw me running the resawn pieces through my planer. But I didn't have a drum sander at the time, and I needed each piece to have one good and flat side to mate to the panel core. So the best idea I came up with was to leave them longer and wider than they needed to be, so all that extra material could act as sort of a sacrificial area and hopefully absorb any of the inevitable splitting and chipping. And it totally worked, but I was definitely clenching tighter than a tick's ass when it came to running these things through the planer. When it came to the finished look of this, I knew I didn't need to worry too much about the top and bottom of the maple panels, since one end would sit on the floor and the other was what the top rested on. But the top was a different story altogether. The outside edges of the top naturally drew your eye to them, so it was important that I put some thought into the grain direction for the panel edge that faced out. Luckily, the other 3 sides would be covered with another strip of walnut to help act as a sort of raised ledge to keep any papers or books on the top while this thing was in use. But the angle of the top also meant that just running the same size piece all the way around would look too boxy and take away from the sleek, angular look of the piece, which is pretty much the main attribute of the overall design. So I decided to taper the side rails towards the front while making them die at the front edge, and then bring all the corners together with an overlapping miter joint. And then one last round of CA glue to address the gaps and knots that are in a few places. You can use either black or clear with this, as both will do a good job matching the natural color of the blemishes in most woods and make it hard to tell where the wood stops and the filler starts. Of all the steps involved with this build, this cut right here was definitely the most nerve-wracking. I've made more compound miter cuts than I can count, but it never fails that I'm as nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rockers when it comes to making these dang cuts. And I'll let you in on a little secret. That self-doubt is exactly why I got the cut right the first time, because I knew I would screw it up. So I made 3 test cuts on some scrap plywood to get the angles set right on the saw and track before making the actual cut. The angles of the design really posed a problem when it came to dry fitting everything, which is important so you can make any last minute adjustments and trim everything to its final size. And as with most physics problems in the shop, it can always be solved with a little bit of redneck ingenuity, otherwise known as a jig. So once again, scrap wood comes to the rescue, which coincidentally is the exact reason why every time I trim something and I'm standing there holding a piece of wood I just cut off in my hand, that same mental battle plays out every time. Do I keep it or toss it? Because any woodworker worth their salt knows that at some point you will 100% have a use for that scrap, so you should definitely keep it. But also every woodworker will 100% generate a dozen more pieces that can do the exact same thing, and we all know we're running out of places to put scraps, because we've already filled the scrap shelf we built, and the designated scrap bin. plus the 5-gallon bucket that we started putting scraps in after the scrap shelf and bin were full. And then there's that one spot on the end of the bench where we set a scrap that one time, which has now grown into the leaning tower of wood scraps that could topple over at any moment. And for the love of God, why can't we just throw away this tiny insignificant piece of wood? And there we are, standing like Bilbo with his ring. After all, why not? Why shouldn't I keep it? Now, it's always good to remember that a temporary jig to hold something in place is, well, temporary. So don't trust it to hold things all by itself. And it's a good thing that maple is one of the hardwoods, because that would have sucked if the panel got dented here on the home stretch. But after a quick once over to make sure we're good, crisis averted. So with the help of the holding jig and some trusty blue tape, I can do a final dry fitting to confirm the height one last time, and give this bad boy a test drive to make sure it's as comfortable to rest your arms on as it looks. And I gotta say, I think it turned out pretty good if I do say so myself. Quick warning for anyone who thinks screws don't belong in custom furniture. I'm about to screw this thing, so you might want to get back up on your high horse and mosey on down the road. Because there's nothing wrong with using screws if they're the best thing for the task at hand. The bottom line is, there are no rules when it comes to this stuff. No matter what the snooty guy with all the fancy tools standing in a workshop that never seems to get dusty says. You do you, and if your customers are happy, then you've succeeded. I've definitely touched on it a few times, but for a relatively simple looking piece, this angular design definitely made for some challenges. And because that theme just won't seem to go away, plus the fact that I'm old and have some physical limitations, but I'll save that for another video, the easiest way for me to finish this guy was to lay it down on some moving blankets and do one side at a time, which is another reason why I'm digging the instant cure quality of UV finishes. Being able to flip this thing over within seconds and keep going was a real backsaver, and made it a heck of a lot easier to apply the final coats of the finish and cure them with this UV light. All in all, this was a challenging but really fun build, and it was the perfect excuse for me to get my hands on this new vacuum setup, which will really help me with some stuff in the future. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, this is John with Olive Grove Woodshop. Keep on building.